Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, the podcast that skips small talk and goes straight for the concepts that shape our thinking and behavior. In this podcast, cold expertise is defenestrated as warm philosophy is enthroned in an attempt to explore the field in which we're all scientists looking for answers, living well. Hello, world. Welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with Eyal Shai. Today, my guest is Ivor Ludlam. Hi, Ivor.
Hello.
And Ivor is an old acquaintance of mine. You're not old. You're just an acquaintance from the past.
I am old.
And yeah, and I've invited you here to discuss dialectic. And dialectic is something which listeners of the podcast have already heard of, but I'm not sure about how much detail I got into. And I'd like to have a discussion on what dialectic is, and also for us to share as much as possible our experiences with doing dialectic. Also, when you were the person who kind of drove the discussion, and as I was just being introduced, and also a little bit of how you discovered it and how it came to be an area of interest for you and so on. How does that sound to you?
That sounds like a lot.
Okay, let's try. Um,
I hope this
yeah,
cat will last an hour
I hope
sitting
so
on
too.
me.
So dialectic, how would you begin the story? Not of what dialectic is, which would be the obvious thing, but just like your knowledge of the concept, and when would be the first time that you kind of come across this concept and start being interested in it?
How far back do you want to go?
As far back as you
I
think
could
is
say, right,
relevant.
let's start when I was 11. I went to grammar school in England, and we learnt as a foreign language French. In the next year, we had a choice between Latin and German. So you can guess which language I chose.
9.
Yeah, I chose German, and the teachers all said, no, you have to learn Latin. For some reason, they thought that intelligent people should learn Latin, and still they thought I should learn Latin. And they said, you can always learn German later on because the teacher is still here. After a few years, he wasn't, so I never got to learn German at school. And so I learnt Latin for how many years would that be? 6 years, something like that. And by chance, I got the best exam results in England and was immediately taken away to Exeter University to do Latin. But when I got there, the secretary at a tea party said, you can't just do Latin, you have to learn something else as well. So I asked her what, and she gave me a list of the usual things you learn with a classical language, like archaeology, history, and all that. And she mentioned Greek, ancient Greek. So I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I'll go and learn ancient Greek. Who teaches ancient Greek? And she pointed to someone in the middle of the room. Nobody was anywhere near him. So I went over and said, I'd like to learn ancient Greek. And his face fell. You could see he was really upset. It turned out later on he thought he was going to have some free time, but now he got a student. So I learned ancient Greek on my own with him for a year. So all of this is quite by chance. It's against everything I ever planned. And then after a year, I was fairly familiar with some texts like Homer and Plato. Then he went off, and I thought he was German, but he was actually from Haifa. So he had returned to Israel, and he went to Tel Aviv. And then after I finished my BA, 2 years later, he wrote to me and said, "You can apply to get a grant to carry on classics in Israel, obviously with him." Um, so that's what I did. I applied for 1 year, got the grant. I didn't know what I was going to do after that year, and I went to Israel to learn Hebrew as the third classical language, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, the lazy way, by being in Israel where everyone speaks ancient Hebrew, right? Uh, and he said, I've been having this problem with Plato. I haven't said he was an expert on Greek philosophy. Um, and he'd been reading Plato, comparing it with what people said, and it just doesn't work. What Socrates says in the dialogues is absolute nonsense. It's not what people say he should have said. So we started thinking about the problem of Plato, and eventually I wrote a seminar paper on a problem in Plato's Republic. That is Thrasymachus in Book One, which is notorious for being a problem. There are lots of articles on it. So I read the articles first, and then I read the dialogue, and I was shocked how different the dialogue was from what people wrote about it. And then for my MA thesis, I wrote on another dialogue, which some people said wasn't Platonic, some people said it was Platonic. So I said, right, I'll ignore that problem. I'll just ask what is in the dialogue, what's happening in the dialogue. That was Hippias Major. And by chance, that's the dialogue by Plato on the good. So, this is all accidental. Everything that I have ever done, nearly everything, has been unplanned, completely accidental. Um, but here's some advice for your listeners: make the most of your opportunities. When something weird happens, jump on it.
Yeah, no,
uh,
this is actually a topic that came up a lot in this podcast, like uncertainty, serendipity, and all that.
yeah.
And it seems to be really a thread that runs through the lives of people who are in a good place in their lives.
If you
Is
think about it,
Mhm.
how could you plan for something you know nothing about?
Right,
The only way is when you're accidentally exposed to it. And I've always thought about this. I was accidentally exposed to Greek philosophy and then to Plato in particular and so on. But it's because there were people who were willing to expose me to it. And I'm passing it on to other people. I'm giving them this chance as well. They
right.
wouldn't have that chance if I didn't do it.
And we haven't even mentioned the one thing you did, which wasn't platonic, which is your relationship with that teacher's daughter, right?
No, haven't mentioned that. And that, I would say, the beginning, as usual, it's accidental. How would I know that he had a daughter? But then, yeah, so we got married. And because of her, I'm now in Israel.
Yeah, there you go.
I
And
wouldn't
because
have
of
been in
all,
Israel without her. It's all a matter of
yeah,
luck,
and
really,
then
but
and then
exploiting the opportunities as they come along. I had to fight to stay here, to
yeah,
be with
for
her.
sure.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
you
it's
know,
not
if
that
we,
I just sit back and let things happen. Once I decide that something's good, then I will fight for it.
yeah, and to extend that story to kind of segue into us meeting, then I will just say that when I came to be a student at the University of Haifa, and that would have been 2012, 11 or 12,
Wow,
and
that was a long
I,
time ago.
yes, that's way too long. Um, and so it's kind of the same kind of serendipitous or really random trajectory where I just sign up for a degree in linguistics and philosophy, but the philosophy somehow is just not what I'm looking for in the first semester. So I drop out, but I decide to take Latin as a second language, and not because I'm required to, just because I'm a language nerd. And then we meet, And then at some point, I remember seeing you speaking with Bana, our friend, and telling her, "Oh, would you like to do philosophy or something like that?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's something that you do. It's not something that you go to an auditorium to hear about all these accounts about Descartes and Hume and Hegel and whatnot. It's something that you do. Yeah, I'd like to do that rather than kind of write down all the opinions of different people. And we basically get to hang out weekly on a weekly basis for the next couple of years or something. And I'm coming to this very unaware of what's going on, also quite confused, and there is no premise really. I'm just at this point a person who is happy to kind of share what's going over them and probably looking for friends. Um, and I don't, yeah, but over time, it's just this becomes very clear that this is interesting to me because I get asked a lot of questions. So I get to think very hard about what I say. And then
And did
I
I ever
think,
tell you anything?
no, except for some bullshit, except for some bullshit which I was supposed to expose. And
Right.
sometimes I haven't. But the interesting thing is that for me, I noticed that all these questions really at first they make me think about what I'm going to say because up until then I was quite good at I don't know if it's like charming people or at least making a good impression because you can kind of understand what the other person expects you to say and you can just say it. And it's not like I was conniving in this way and just thinking about that meeting people, but it seems to have been something that I did. And once you meet somebody who's not particularly impressed with what you say and presses against it all the time with questions, or at least makes you
Until
think
today.
about it, yeah, yeah. Um, so the first part is kind of this just becoming quite frustrated with an inability to be your normal self. But then at some point, thinking about what it is that the other person is trying to make you think and what the benefit is going to be um, from it. So I don't know for how long the word dialectic did not even come up in conversation because it wasn't framed as a weekly dialectic thing or in any way really.
Yeah. Do you know
Um,
why? We never actually talked about that.
what do you mean?
Why did we not talk about the word dialectic?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's because you don't have to talk about something to do it, I
Exactly.
imagine.
It's like
Yeah.
talking about philosophy altogether. There's no point. You just have to get into it. You start doing it. And then
Yeah,
you can say,
absolutely.
oh, and by the way, this is called so and so afterwards.
Yeah, I was just reading the beginning of Symposium just earlier today, and straight at the beginning, somebody tells somebody, I can't remember the characters right now, but somebody's telling somebody, it's like just kind of scolding other people for rich people just discussing things and not doing philosophy. But I'm really into. Oh, but he says like I'm really interested in your account of that night at the banquet. What did Socrates say about love there, right? So, in essence, it's like mocking people who just discuss things for the sake of just passing the time, but at the same time, really interested
That
in
that person
knowing
happened
something.
to be interested in rhetoric,
Right.
and the whole of the symposium is about rhetoric. There are lots of speeches, and the person who remembered all of this is someone who is interested in rhetoric. So the people who are holding this conversation aren't really interested in philosophy. It's
Exactly.
interesting.
Exactly. So I think that's actually a pretty good segue to kind of talk a little bit about the difference between rhetoric and dialectic. So to be sure, I'm going to positively say to listeners, this is about dialectic, but it's quite important to understand a little bit of the history behind it. And I think what came before dialectic is rhetoric, right? There's no question about which kind of became a thing, right?
No,
First.
no, they came together really. In Sicily, people were beginning to work out how to persuade people, and the general story is that someone called Corax, the raven or the crow, um, saw that people were not winning their cases in court against the tyrant who was just deposed, and he drew up a list of things that they should say and shouldn't say. One of the things people shouldn't say in court is the truth. The truth does not persuade people, especially if the case, and cases in court usually are this sort, a case which isn't ordinary. People know what is ordinary and they think that what is ordinary is true. Normally, if you have a tall man and a short man, this is the example he gave, and the tall man you would expect would always be able to beat the short man. But in this court case, the short man is accused of stealing the tall man's cloak. So in court, if they said that, if either of them said that, he'd lose because it's completely implausible. So the tall man would say, this short man and his friends stole my cloak. The short man, all he has to say is, what, me? I'm a short man. I couldn't possibly take his cloak. This at the time wasn't called rhetoric. And then someone from Sicily called Gorgias happened to come to Athens in 427. He was sent there by his city to plead their case for some reason. And he did that, and everyone was so impressed with him that some young aristocrats wanted to learn how to persuade from him. Again, it's still not rhetoric. He's just teaching people how to persuade, and that involves not telling the truth. Meanwhile, another person comes to Athens in 427 from the north, and that's Protagoras. And Protagoras has been working on language, what language is, and so on. And he's also from the north, where people are already a bit more skeptical about the gods telling us things through poetry, that sort of thing. They think, no, that's just man-made. So he and Gorgias together, they don't actually necessarily talk together or anything, but people study with both of them, and gradually we get this mix which becomes rhetoric. So rhetoric is to do with using language, knowing how to use language in such a way that it persuades people. So they work on beautiful language, beautiful structure, all that sort of thing, using the right sort of words. There are certain words you shouldn't ever use, and there are some words you should use. It's just like modern business language, same thing.
Right. So
So,
let's um yeah, go ahead. Do you want?
so that's the rhetorical side, and this led to a degeneration, and some people thought this led to the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. So to react to this, we get people like Socrates. And at the beginning, I don't think there were other people. It was just Socrates at the beginning. And he started questioning people because that's the only way to stop them being persuaded unthinkingly by beautiful language. So he started asking questions, having conversations with people, and this is the art of discussion. Now, what's the word for discussion?
Dialogos.
Dialogos, dialogos. And dialogos is dia and logos. Logos, among other things, is speech or thought or reason or a
Right.
word or a sentence. Um, this is all because logos actually means collection. A collection of letters is a word, a collection of words is a sentence, a collection of sentences is a speech, a collection of words is a sentence which can be used in the mind, and it becomes a thought, an opinion, or even reasoning. Dia means through, not to. To is duo. This is a common mistake. People think dialogos means a discussion between two people. It's a discussion between, it doesn't say between whom, normally between people, but it can also be a dialogos between a person and his own soul, so an internal discussion. And the adjective describing something pertaining to language is, you know this one,
What the
the yeah,
uh, sorry, you mean
the adjective
uh
pertaining to a conversation.
dialecticos or
Dialecticos.
dialecticon? Yeah.
So dialecticos is someone who indulges in discussion, and the art techne, from which we get technion, techne is feminine, so techne dialectike.
The
So
art of conversation.
the art pertaining to conversation, while techne rhetorike, the art pertaining to speechifying.
Yeah,
to,
to
to
flow of words.
The definition of rhetoric is the art of persuasion.
Right.
In classical literature, that is the definition.
Right. And
Dialectic, or another one is to speak beautifully, while
right.
the definition of dialectic is to speak well. That's the
Hmm.
difference. To speak beautifully, to speak well, where well means actually for a good reason, a good end.
Right. So let's connect that with your story and the point at which you begin work on Platonic dialogues. Um, the word itself is not something that Socrates called his own art, right? It's not a term that actually. I'm not even sure.
Socrates
Is it in any
doesn't
of the
have
dialogues?
Socrates doesn't have an art. He doesn't call himself skilled at anything apart from
Right.
love. But that's a joke anyway. Uh,
Right. And is the word itself, does it appear at all in the
it does
Platonic
appear.
corpus? It does appear. Okay.
He says at one point with Meno, we should talk dialecticos,
Hmm.
not as uh, um, eristicians. Can have another
Right. Right.
eristikos. An eristician is someone who indulges in eris, which is strife,
Debate or yeah.
competition. Competition is not even debate. Well, debate in the original sense.
Yeah.
Debata
Hmm.
is to beat down.
Yeah.
Anything to do with winning. Now, how
Right.
do you win in a conversation? How can you do that? You told me that 2 and 2 is 5. I say 2 and 2 is 4. Have I won? No. I've just
Right.
said what's true, and you don't even have to accept it. You can carry on saying it's 5. So that
Right.
isn't how you win. How do you win? If there are people listening to the conversation, then you aim everything that you say to them. You want them to think that your opponent is stupid, and they will at some point start laughing at that opponent, and that's the sign that you've won. So winning
Yes.
is humiliating the opponent.
So it's very important, like the framing for people listening, like to kind of gain an understanding of the framing. Yeah, I think the one that appears in the Mino is super important. You can talk with people and use words, but the framing of it is very important. Are you competing with them as some sort of person who has to win over the other one or persuade the other one, and if not the other one, all the people that are going to mock the other one? Or are you friends who are about to go on a shared search for the truth? And if you find somebody who's not your friend at all, and is just looking to make his point and prove that he's right, uh, a shared search of anything is not possible, right?
Do you want an example of dialectic?
If you want to, yeah, put one in
Because
there.
you said that dialectic is where friends have a shared search for the truth. So I can ask you several things. Do they have to be friends?
Well, I. So now we're not talking meta. We're gonna do the thing, huh?
This is
Um,
the actual thing.
yes, yes. No, I relish it. We haven't had it in a while, so yeah. So this is exactly the type of thing, right? Then we would have to go on a shared search of the truth regarding the term friend,
Wait, wait,
for
wait,
example.
wait. I asked you a question, you're avoiding it.
I'm a good rhetorician,
Yes. Do they have to be friends?
but I mean, really, it depends on what friendship is. Is it a one way thing, or is it by definition mutual? Right. That's one thing we have to answer. When you're asking, do they have to be friends? I'd say that to do dialectic, you need a friend in there.
So one of them has to be a friend to the
Right.
other. Does the
Yes.
other one have to know that that person is a friend?
Well, I was just telling everybody that I came into your office on a weekly basis, not having an idea what we were supposed to do there.
Exactly, yeah. um, Now, shared search for the truth. This is a common misconception. This is how most scholars describe dialectic. And they see Socrates in the dialogues as inept as his uh, what do you call a bloke? His
Interlocutor.
interlocutor.
Yeah.
His interlocutor, yeah. Um, if they were both completely in the dark, they had no idea where they were going, would Socrates talk the way he talks? Would he lead the conversation the way he leads the conversation?
Right. No. So in a
No.
sense,
Right now, next question
yeah.
before you ruin everything. If Socrates does know the answer, why don't we ever reach an answer in the dialogue?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so let's backtrack into your story again. Like if dialectic is just a term that appears in the Meno, but in terms of actually trying to or starting to uncover some of the truth about Plato's dialogues in your research, what is like an early working hypothesis, um, and what would be the point when you discover dialectic? And I don't know if it's because you encountered this specific word in the Meno or through some other means, but when does dialectic itself as a concept stick out to you as something that's very important when reading Plato?
When I analyzed Hippias Major, there were two um, participants, Socrates and Hippias. And my question then was, why do they talk to each other? They must have a reason for talking to each other, otherwise they wouldn't talk to each other. I know it's a very daring concept, but it worked at the time. What's interesting is that you can't just say, what is Socrates' motive? He's talking to people. What are their motives? This is something people forget, that everybody has a motive. and it transpired that Hippias was talking to Socrates because he is completely concerned, obsessed with appearing to be good. And in order to appear to be good, he needs an audience. And in this particular case, it's Socrates. That's the best he can do. There's only Socrates there. Usually he has many people as his audience, and he knows what to do with many people. He always appears good to the many. But Socrates isn't the many, and Socrates asks questions, but Socrates has a problem. If he asks questions which makes it clear that he isn't impressed by Hippias, what would Hippias do?
Go away.
He would go away. Is that a guess? No, Hippias says that in the middle of the dialogue. He says, if someone talked to me like that person talks to you, Socrates made somebody up who talks really badly to Socrates. If someone talked to me like that, I would leave. Now, Socrates knows that, so he cannot afford to look as though he's not impressed by Hippias. So he always frames his questions to make it look as though he is still very impressed with Hippias, and yet if Hippias understood what Socrates was saying and applied what Socrates was saying to himself, he would realize that there's something wrong with his entire attempt to appear to be good to everyone. What's the point of appearing to be good? Now, that was his motive, to appear to be good, and it's very clear. What the motive for Socrates wasn't so clear at the beginning. Why is he doing this? In fact, a lot of people think Socrates is just a psychopath who enjoys uh, ruining the lives of other people,
Yeah.
asking them difficult questions. But he has a reason. And if you think about it, what would happen to Hippias if he did begin to think critically, if he did begin to ask himself questions like, why am I doing this? What's the point?
Well, I
Would that
mean,
be better or worse?
it would be better for him,
It would be
and
better.
also
So
incidentally,
Socrates,
he might begin to see Socrates as a sort of teacher. That's another thing.
well, that's another thing. Was Socrates ever a teacher? Did he teach?
No, but that doesn't mean you couldn't learn from him.
Well, it depends who you ask. Plato's Socrates does say things. Well, normally, if he says anything dogmatic, it's absolute rubbish. Normally, he asks questions. Actually,
Mhm.
when he says something absolute rubbish, people love it. They say, "Oh, yes, good. He said something
Yeah.
intelligent for once." The person who has a Socrates who teaches is Xenophon. Xenophon wrote dialogues as well, and Socrates there gives advice.
And
It's a completely different Socrates.
if I remember correctly, Xenophon lived in after Plato, and so he might have been reading Plato's dialogue. So he did not have
You're
immediate,
half right.
right?
You're half right. Socrates and Xenophon lived at the same time. They both knew Socrates, but
Hmm.
then Xenophon left Athens before Socrates was killed, um, just after the end of the Peloponnesian War, so around 403 BC. Socrates was put on trial in 399, so that's 5 years later. Xenophon went with his friend from Thebes, who was a captain on the winning side in the Peloponnesian War, the Dorian side, Sparta, Thebes, all those cities, and the Persian brother of the king of Persia uh, decided that the only way to beat his brother and become king himself is to get all of the winning soldiers in the Greek war to come with him against his brother,
Mm.
together with all his Persians. He had Persians as well, but the Greeks were the secret weapon. And so they all went off to fight against his brother near Babylon. There was a big battle, and they lost, but the Greeks won. So for a while, the Greeks thought that they'd won. They couldn't see anybody else, and then they realized that all the other Persians had run away. And then the Persian king did his best to kill them, but they were Greek soldiers. They're really good. Greek soldiers are amazing. They're like a tank, and they just went wandering around until they got to the Black Sea. But before that, there was an act of betrayal. The friend of the Greeks on the Persian side, Tissaphernes, invited them all to a meal, a meeting in a tent. And when they were all there, the commanders, that is, when the commanders were all there, they were all murdered. So the Greek army had no commanders.
And
So what did they
Xenophon is
do?
where? Where is Xenophon? With them?
He's at he's not one of the commanders. He's a friend of one of the commanders. So
Hmm.
he's outside. So the Greek army voted for new commanders, and they put Xenophon in charge, the Athenian, on the losing side in the war. They chose him to be the commanding officer, presumably because they could all agree that he's useless. So they put him in charge. It's better than someone they would have rivalry with. And he led them out to the Black Sea. But because the Spartans had won the war, they were everywhere by now, and they were up in the Black Sea as well. And a commander in the Black Sea forced them to fight with him against some Athenian force up in the, this is after the war, but they're still fighting. And when the Athenians heard about that, they exiled Xenophon. There's no way he's coming back to Athens, the traitor.
Right.
So the Spartans gave him a home in Lacedaemonia, the area of Sparta, and that's where he wrote his books, proving that he was a wonderful Athenian. And how does he prove that? By showing that all the other Athenians are bastards. They're terrible people. They killed Socrates, who was the best Athenian citizen ever. And he describes Socrates as he sees a very good Athenian citizen. So it's all
Right.
rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, that was
Now, the thing
quite
is,
the winding
how,
story.
right, and how can he write about Socrates if he wasn't there for his death? Obviously, he used other sources. Now, who wrote about the death of Socrates? Plato. So, we have an interesting situation where Xenophon and Plato disagree on many things about Socrates, especially his philosophy, but sometimes they agree on things. Now, it used to be the case that people said if they agree on something, that must be real, that must be true. But actually, if they agree, it means Xenophon copied Plato.
Gotcha.
So we don't really know much about the historical Socrates. We know some things, but not very much.
Right. Yeah. No, that's thanks for the elucidation there. I want to take you back to like your own personal story. I told you it was this kind of podcast. But after having come across the idea of dialectic, the concept of dialectic, and encountering it, um, could you
Oh,
share?
well, no,
Yeah.
I'm still in the Hippias Major thing.
Okay.
Socrates, I worked out, was representing a good person. And then the question is, so in what way is he good? Aren't there other good people? For example, you can have a doctor, a teacher, whatever. He's none of those. He's not a teacher. He just asks questions. Why is he chosen to represent the good person, as opposed to
Mm,
Hippias, who is the apparently good person, but not a good person. Um, Hippias appears good. He looks good. He's well dressed. He's well spoken. But he's actually harmful because he teaches the wrong things. And what exactly does he teach people? Not to think critically. They accept what he says. While Socrates is the opposite. He's ugly, he's very badly dressed, he's badly spoken, but he's doing this thing. He's trying to get someone to think critically. So this is the height of being beneficial, thinking critically. And then I thought, so what is this? How does Plato call this art of thinking critically? And that's pretty obvious by then that it's dialectic, but it doesn't appear in the dialogue.
right. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I for you then personally, having kind of understood this, do you what is the process like of infusing your own life with this? Because this must have been
Well, I just annoy people.
yeah. um
The other thing before we go on, there is informal dialectic, which is the way Socrates does things. Because he doesn't tell people he's doing dialectic, it's informal. He doesn't go through all the due process of dialectic, but Plato himself and his followers did practice formal dialectic. They say in advance, I'm the dialectician, you are the person receiving the treatment. So I ask the questions, you answer the questions. No mistake here. This is the way it's going to go. And this is an indication that it's not a shared search for the truth. The one who's asking the questions already knows where they're supposed to go. So he asks not any old question, he asks the sorts of questions that will lead this particular person to the understanding necessary. First time we've mentioned understanding. If I told you that the good is the fitting, you'd say, oh, that's interesting. You'd write it down in your notebook, but would you understand what that meant? No, you wouldn't.
right.
Which is why we have dialectic. I ask you all sorts of questions which are aimed at getting you to say, oh, that's good because it's fitting to that. I mean, you get to that realization yourself. I never said, at the beginning at least, fitting or dialectic, sometimes not even good. I just ask you questions and
Yes.
you would get to those answers yourself. That is the only way to get you to understand anything.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, like seeing that I invite people on Twitter and elsewhere to do dialectic. Then it must mean that I am Plato and you're Socrates. um, yeah, and I mean, this is what I tell people about dialectic, is that it's, if we go back to like the shared search for truth, it's not that it's shared in the sense that we're both people are in the dark, but you have a guide, and it's the guide's job to understand and to frame things according to the understanding of the student and their worldview. And so it's, there's a lot of
Yeah,
kind of,
it's not all that easy for the dialectician. The dialectician has to understand the student.
right. So there's a lot of mind surgery, sort of, to like
Yes. Yeah.
see what goes in there, in the person's mind, and that's the
Which means I do actually listen to you. Sorry for interrupting.
right.
I do actually listen to all of your stories, and I understand what your interests are. That's always useful because then I can use your interests to help you understand things in other fields.
Yeah, and the downside is that you have to go along with some digressions that are completely.
But it is interesting.
It
I
is
know where it's all going, so it's good.
right, right. Um, yeah, so for me personally, like understanding this, or at whatever point in time we did say, "Oh, we were doing dialectic," or I was kind of starting to understand what's going on there. There's I can't think of a word, but it's definitely a subjective experience of things falling into place, and
Yes,
this
things click.
things click for sure. And you know where you get the feeling that things click when you do puzzles, and that is kind of
Or
what
read dialogues.
or that, and I'm saying that they.
After 5 years
Mhm.
of reading a few pages, because Hippias Major isn't that long, it's about 30 pages. It took me about 5 years, and one day, eventually, suddenly, boom, I got it.
Yeah, so
It took
that's
that long.
and they are puzzles. They are. I mean,
Yeah.
and I'm interested in the like the personal subjective experience of walking with it in the world is I can testify completely different from before. So I'm wondering, like in your case, um, could you describe any part of this subjective experience of having understood dialectic and maybe this first dialogue and what it changes in your personal life?
Uh, that's hard.
Well, what
This
what
is
is
over half my life now. It's not that I've been uh, living like this for a year or so. It's about 30 years.
I know, but do you remember maybe? So the concept of the good is discussed in Hippias Major, but having understood that this is dialectic and you can apply it in the search for truth of a concept, right? What would be like one of the first concepts where you thought, "Oh, this can be done independently"? And you mentioned dialogue could be a dialogue within yourself, right, between you and your mind or
Yes.
whatever.
Yeah.
Then if you understand this thing, you can set out to work on certain problems and certain concepts. And really, that's what Plato wants you to do. Plato is not even interested in you really getting his meaning of each and every concept. And he does it in Greek too. Like, that would be different.
That's a question. How do we know what he wanted? Because his take on concepts is pretty good.
Uh,
What I do a lot of the time is try to be critical about his concepts,
and
try to develop them.
uh,
And what's interesting is we have a case in Plato. Hippias Minor deals with uh, one concept. Do you know what the concept is?
power, yeah.
Yeah, dynamis. It's a power or ability. And then, and in that dialogue, it's already showing that ability can be used or abused. When it's abused, it's in order to appear good. People with power like to show that they have power, and other people are impressed by it, and they say, aha, that person is good. This is an abuse of power. While the person with power, Socrates, doesn't look as though he has any power. He's a pathetic, I don't know if he's old in this case, but he's not really taken seriously by the others. He's more entertaining, and he's used by them to uh, cross examine Hippias, and they're too afraid to do that themselves because they know they would be shown up by heuristics. People would laugh at them. So they get him to do it for them. So this is already the idea that there is the appearance of good and actually being good, and
Hmm.
they appear to be the opposite of what they are. And this is what he develops in Hippias Major. Has he changed his mind? No, he's added to what he already had. He developed because it doesn't use concepts arbitrarily or he doesn't theorize and then try to apply it to reality. He starts with reality and abstracts from reality.
Right.
This is what the dialogues are about. They are a dramatization of reality uh, in essence. He's giving us the essence of the whole of reality. You might say, but he only uses men and not women and that sort of thing. But that itself is irrelevant because the men here are just men. They're humans who represent concepts. We could have used women,
Right.
but in his time, it would have looked a bit weird. So he uses men.
So I
But
so Ivor, I want to though like that's such a good point. I was thinking about the fact that Plato had people over at his house and he wrote 30 something dialogues or around 30. Um,
36.
36. Yeah, I don't know if that includes like the bad ones that are
No,
probably
no,
not.
no.
Yeah.
That's 36, and
Okay.
then there are some additional
Okay,
ones
so
which he didn't
36
write.
dialogues. What I meant to say was that, in each of them, like, is reading them and analyzing them and arriving at Plato's understanding of them very good for us? Yes, because he was super smart upon examination, and we might as well just find that he was right and creating accurate concepts. But I meant that, to us, for example, I don't know, even though I can read Greek with some proficiency and I can analyze it with some proficiency and I can gain an understanding. In the end, after having read these 36 dialogues, yes, you might arrive at maybe over 36 good, well formed, accurate, true concepts. But I think Plato's idea was to give his students the ability to think critically so that they could think about any concept that they like and make it well formed, right? That was
Yeah,
my
yeah,
point.
yes, yes.
So
And
mhm,
obviously we are living in a different world here. We're not
like
living in the Athenian polis
thinking in a different language.
in the and in a different language, and so obviously we do have to think continuously, which is what he would want us to do anyway. Always
Exactly.
criticize. Don't assume that you have the final answer. Earlier, when I said that the dialectician is the one who knows and he guides the student, obviously the one who knows carries on thinking as well.
Right. So that was my meaning when I set out to ask you what would be some concept that you then felt empowered to think about yourself and an area in your life to work on, or it could be just an example. It doesn't have to be the first one. But
Yeah, I don't think of one concept. That's the thing. I think of the whole system of concepts because they're all intertwined.
yeah, no, that's true. I mean, obviously, it's true because it's going to be you. I mean, anybody who does dialectic is going to discover that everything is connected, and we're talking about a matrix, not something in isolation. But to me, at least, it was, at one point, it is beneficial to concentrate on one thing, and as you kind of probe around it, because I see the process of dialectic as trying to find the boundaries of a thing more than actually trying to immediately go and describe the thing as it is, right? Because if you find the limits of a thing, you also by definition know the thing itself. And then when you come across a boundary or a limit or a surface, you find that there's something else on the other side of that surface, right? And that's going to be another concept. So one image to think about is maybe like when you blow like soap bubbles, but there are many, many of them. They're in a cluster and they have their surfaces touching one another. Now, this can't be true because actually, like bubbles that are farther away and don't have shared surfaces, like in reality, they do. It's not something that we can exactly visualize in 3D space. But I hope the image works to some extent. And
I've added bubbles to my list of interests that you have.
Yeah,
I will use
perfect.
bubbles in the future.
Yes, very good, very good. And yeah, I'm sure you'll be telling me that you're sorry to pop my bubble when it comes to something. um, yeah, so I have found it beneficial to meditate, and meditate in the sense of just thinking hard about a concept, for example, justice, because when you start from one concept, it's just naturally at some point you're going to leave that concept and put it aside on hold, right? And go and kind of examine something adjacent to it that touches on it. And that thing you're going to put on hold as your interest is picked in some other adjacent concept that relates to both of them necessarily. And the whole um the whole
There's something that unites all of them,
mhm,
the good,
right, which is
because they are all aspects of the good.
right. Yeah, and they also have to have good proportion between them.
I spend a lot of time thinking about fittingness, in what ways things are fitting, how we might confuse fittingness between things. I see it all the time on the internet, on the news. Um, and if I decided that asking people questions is the best thing I can possibly do, surely I should be asking everyone I come across questions. But I don't. Now,
Thankfully, because then you would
and,
be
and in this
executed like
way,
Socrates.
exactly. In this way, I'm more like the philosophers who came after Socrates, who all realized that Socrates took it to an extreme. Although I
Well,
don't think he was executed because he asked
well,
questions,
and
but
of course, let's remember that just because this is what Socrates does in Plato's dialogues does not necessarily
doesn't
mean
mean he did it.
right, right, which is
Right.
important.
And the other thing is that the characters in a dialogue are models representing aspects of an idea. They are not meant to be role models that we should follow.
Right. And for what it's worth, he is actually well liked among some of the people who appear in the dialogue. So it's not like we can paint a picture where Socrates is universally annoying by people. So this could be an
But there are people who like people who annoy people.
that's
It's
true.
fun.
That's that's true. But I mean, some of them attribute him with an ability to have helped them in the past and so on. So I'm just saying this to point out that this, for example, could be something to ponder when reading a dialogue. Like Socrates is almost never doing anything that pleases anyone in a dialogue. Yes, yet to kind of give an accurate atmosphere to the whole thing, sometimes you do encounter people who like him for past discussions they've had with him or something like that, or they do appreciate his conduct. Let's say.
It's more usually emphasized that nothing actually changes. And that is important in the dialogues because they are models. Models cannot change. It's
Right.
impossible for models to change. We are not models. We are human beings. And we are supposed to realize that we can think critically, and then we can try to make other people think critically. That's the best we can do.
So yeah, and I'd like to share something from that time when I did dialectic with you intensively, and that is the fact, and I don't know whether to call it a side effect or a derivation
A
or
trauma.
derivative or anything like that. But one interesting thing I noticed is that it helped me listen to people, and it
Uh-huh.
was just um, such an interesting experience because listening, it doesn't mean that you don't talk at some point, but actively listening, engaged listening is something which is very clearly more beneficial to the person you're discussing things with because you're able to actually refer to what they just said and put yourself in their shoes. Also, it's very beneficial to us because we don't have to bring our own shit and our own baggage into every conversation and get lost in this chatter in our mind that's already thinking about what we want to say in order to um, salvage some sort of ego that is constantly threatened by what people say, right? I don't know, for some reason our egos, when they want to save themselves, they just want to assert their own existence by having you talk about them in certain ways. So I don't know, like, what do you make of that? That this is something that just naturally comes with um, dialectical thinking,
The more you practice dialectic, the more relaxed you'll be. You'll stop having your internal turmoil,
right?
and you'll be stronger. You'll be able to help other people.
Yeah, and this relates to something which appeared in an episode I just released with Pamela Hobart. But the whole idea of mental health and what health is in the end, and why it is really, if you had to have one thing and kind of, in the sense that somebody thought, is like, what is the one thing that you would like to have, and you can't mention any other things. Never mind the fact that there are aspects of that thing and they're all related. But if you had to come up with one answer of something that's worth having, if having is the correct usage here, it's not, but it would be mental health, right? The absence of internal strife. So in the end, of course, this has to do with fittingness too. No surprise there at this point. Um, but
This is in agreement with most Greek philosophers who would put the healthy soul as the main thing.
right,
If you do anything that affects a healthy soul, then you shouldn't do it.
then you should.
And on the other hand,
What's that?
you shouldn't, you should not do anything which threatens the healthy soul.
Right, which is interesting because this kind of um, relates to Socrates' description of his daimon, right? Which is
Yeah,
a
you might say
spirit.
that
Mhm.
when he dies, he has affected rather badly his soul. His soul ends together with him,
Mhm.
unless he believes in an afterlife. We don't know really. But the point is, you don't want an unhealthy soul while you're alive. If he had compromised his principles, his soul would have been unhealthy,
Right, but it's not
and that
even
was what he was avoiding.
this diamond from that tells him that he should in fact just comply and drink the poison. I'm talking about the framing of the diamond as a spirit that tells him what not to do rather than what to
Yes,
do,
yes, yes, yes.
and
In Plato, in Xenophon, it's the other way
mhm,
around.
tells him what to do,
That
like positively.
it tells him what to do,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, so that's
or what will happen.
and that's a really interesting thing, because I noticed that in our lives, and generally speaking, growing up in Western society, we grow up to be hedonists, right? um, Maybe there are cultures that have solved for this and can raise you to be not a hedonist when you grow up. I don't know, but in our culture, we grow up to be hedonist, and one thing I realized is just how deeply it's ingrained in us that thinking about health as just the absence of sickness, it almost pains people to think in terms of not looking forward to a reward, right? And it just goes to show like how much we're born with this view that we should always be looking towards a reward and then kind of compute back like, oh, what do I have to get to that reward exactly? Whereas keeping
It encourages the
Mhm.
feeling of lack. There's something we don't have.
Right.
While in fact, if you have a healthy soul, you have everything.
Right.
and then anything else is a bonus.
And then, yeah, and then it's really interesting because this is a very strange quality for somebody who hasn't done dialectic, who hasn't come to this understanding, right? You can't really, it's nearly ineffable in words to tell somebody who's a hedonist, to describe to them what it's like not to lack something. That's hard to do.
Plato has a go at it in Philebus. The pleasure is normally the filling up of a lack. Like uh, you enjoy drinking because you're
Scratching
thirsty.
an itch. Yeah.
Scratching an itch is Callicles in Gorgias.
Okay, there you go. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
it's the same idea. Uh, Even Epicurus, who everyone thinks is a hedonist, he is a hedonist, but the pleasure he aims for is the lack of pain.
yeah.
That's it, the lack of pain. He's not going after any pleasure at all. In fact, a lot of pleasures lead to pain, so he avoids those pleasures.
Right.
There are extreme
It's the less
hedonists.
fun version of a hedonist. Yeah.
And in a way, when you say having a good soul leads to a calm life and Euroia, a good flowing of life, that sounds like you're being hedonist, but actually you're only saying it to a hedonist because it's just something that happens along with having a healthy soul, which is the main thing.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, yeah. What do you feel like with this podcast? Is there anything else that we should add right now, or save something for
Not
a
right
later
now.
episode?
We can store up a few things for next time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, this.
Ask your listeners what we should talk about. If there was anything in this that they want developing a
Yeah,
bit.
for sure. Yeah, well, Ivor, it's been a great pleasure to get you on a long form podcast. Finally, we did some short ones before, and yeah, for anybody who's
Yeah.
listening, I am doing dialectic with people, and it doesn't cost anything. So I'll be Plato, and then Ivor, what do you do, just so people get a better
What do I
idea?
do?
Yeah, I don't know. They might think that because you're Socrates, you're just walking around in rags all day and not showering
Well,
very often.
basically, that's what I do. I'm very unpopular in my workplace. Uh,
And
so
also,
you want
well, a little bit, and then also where some of your work could be found, podcast, books, and so on.
uh, so officially I teach Latin and ancient Greek. I'm not allowed to be a philosopher, and don't ask why. I don't know why. Um, and that's about it, really. That's what I do, and I help loads of people with research. And uh, yeah, so what do I do? My podcast is the Plato Paradigm, which you can find in most good bookshops. Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube. Those are the main ones. That's where you can find it.
And books.
I have books, but that's not interesting.
Okay, I'll link to them anyway with your permission.
Oh, all right.
Or at least the one that can still be found.
I mean, they're very interesting, but whenever I give someone a book to read, they don't read it. So I've stopped pushing
That's true,
books.
but I try nevertheless. I try. They're super interesting, and I highly recommend reading about them because the whole method of analyzing Platonic dialogues is laid out in them, um, and kind of shows the path for anyone who's interested in learning ancient Greek and analyzing dialogues by themselves. Then that's the way to do it. Um,
That would be nice because most people actually working in the field don't read my books.
right.
They go out of their way not to read my books because they disagree.
Yeah.
And the worst thing you can have is a critical way of thinking. So.
All right, Ivor. Well, this has been a pleasure. After I hit stop, still hang on for a minute, and
All right.
yeah, for everybody listening, till next time.
All right. Bye bye.